Carrier keeping 1,000 Indiana employees is not Trump heroism. It's government crony capitalism. We start with Jay Caruso again at Red State for the first segment here. Now, when word spread that Carrier, an Indiana air conditioning company, was going to keep 1,000 of the approximately 2,200 jobs they were going to send to Mexico, he, at least, was cautiously optimistic. I wasn't, because I know Donald Trump. Early reports said Donald Trump spoke with the company and told them reductions in corporate taxes and scaling back regulations would save the company enough money to keep some of the jobs in the United States. Caruso's cautiousness was punctuated with what he wrote at the time. If it is found a particular tax break for Carrier is located in any budget bill, then yes, the criticism is valid. Well, it turns out a federal tax break wasn't needed for Carrier. Indiana was coerced into stepping up to the plate. This quote comes to us from the Washington Post. Carrier, the company that changed its plans to shutter a plant in Indianapolis and shift production to Mexico after talks with President-elect Donald Trump, confirmed Wednesday that it would receive financial assistance from the state of Indiana as part of the deal to keep the plant open. Corporate welfare, in other words. Today's announcement is possible because the incoming Trump-Pence regime has emphasized to us its commitment to support the business community, subsidize it, in other words, and create an improved, more competitive U.S. business climate. Actually less competitive, because if you have government subsidies saving you from tough economic choices, you're in essence on the dole. That's not pro-competitive, that's anti-competitive. You're saying that Carrier can't compete. In essence. As a statement from the company read, the incentives offered by the state were an important consideration. In other words, every man has his price. And there you have it. Forget the flowery talk about Donald Trump and Mike Pence. They did this because of whatever sweetheart deal they were able to get from the state of Indiana, where Pence is still the governor. Draining the swamp? Not bloody likely. Puerto Rico jumped into the fray yesterday. Here's the first headline. Why crony capitalism like Trump's Carrier deal is a problem. As Jay Caruso noted, as I just shared with you, the Carrier deal touted by Donald Trump is based in part on a corporate tax break offered by Indiana, Mike Pence's state, remember. And Jim Jamatis will have more soon about the fact that Carrier's parent company, United Technologies, has far more to lose from its deals with the federal government. This was not an offer. These were not talks. This was an ultimatum delivered with the police power of the United States government behind it. In other words, it was a threat and a bribe. I'd like to talk here not about the newsy part of this, but why the economics is bad. Politics are even worse, but the economics, bad, bad, bad. After all, it seems reasonable to say, as a correspondent told me on Twitter, why complain about crony capitalism, which seems like an abstract notion, when 1,000 more families are going to have a Christmas where the breadwinner has a job? Isn't that a liberal argument? Doesn't sound like a conservative one. Convincing you that it's a problem is not something I'm likely to succeed in doing in one blog post. Again, it's playing on the public's emotions. That's always the most visible part. It's classic liberal do-goodism. You know, the sob story gambit. You know, the people who are helped, well, they're in the Rose Garden with the president, and the press covers it, and oh, it's so compassionate, and the cost in jobs never created and jobs lost somewhere else, well, that doesn't get any attention. That's invisible. Classic liberal statist do-goodism. If you're a fan of the deal, I'm not looking to. Well, I am trying to change your mind to at least. If you're gonna be wrong, at least understand why you're wrong. I guess is what I'm saying. All I want to do is make you wonder whether maybe, just maybe, you're wrong. First of all, let's look at basic fairness. Carrier has competitors, right? And they're not all foreign. I counted 14 air conditioning manufacturers or suppliers in Indiana alone, and only one of them is Carrier. Are all of these companies going to get the same tax breaks? I doubt it. If not, why would you tell the employees of the competing companies who maybe have their salaries cut or employees get laid off because they are now having a tougher time competing against another company that got a tax break so Donald Trump could get a headline? And if all the Indiana air conditioning manufacturers get tax breaks, what then? Well, it's going to get bloody expensive is what then. Imagine you're a consumer who has a few $1,000s to spend on home repair, which, by the way, I do not. If you could see my house, you would know what I was talking about. Your air conditioning system is getting older, but so is your roof. But hey, it looks like the air conditioning manufacturers who got all the tax breaks are offering better deals these days on new air conditioning systems. Meanwhile, roofers who don't get tax breaks are offering nothing. You and hundreds of other homeowners like you decide to purchase new air conditioning systems rather than spend your money elsewhere. So, if air conditioning manufacturers get tax breaks but other businesses don't, this too hurts other businesses and their employees who will lose their jobs. Bottom line is this. When government picks winners, it is also picking losers. But if you see only the winners, you may conclude that there's no problem. In other words, it's free! It's free! Free lunch for everybody! No. No. Tanstaffel. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. The thing is, government intervention is usually popular. And now it has an R after it. It's like I warned. It's like we told you. This is another. See, we told you so. And it's also usually counterproductive. But the counterproductive parts are harder to see until the government intervention becomes widespread. Then when the stores go empty and the lines for supplies get long, you can finally see it. But by then it's too late. A lot of people in Russia loved communism, which is just government intervention to the nth degree until millions starved. The folks in Venezuela loved them some government intervention. Ask them how they like it now. Now, I'm not saying one tax break is communism yet. There's always a pebble at the head of the avalanche. But it is an example of government interference in the economy on a small scale, while communism is an example of government interference on a huge scale. But I don't buy it that it's unintended. The intended consequences of government interference are not abstract. They are very real. Just ask Carrier's competitors who didn't get a tax break because they haven't threatened to move anything to Mexico yet. Incentives, ladies and gentlemen, incentives. Why? What reason do any of Carrier's competitors have to not make the same threat if they can get the same carrot, the same benefit, the same perk, the same bribe? And thus is what's left of the private sector more and more corrupted. Because they will make that same threat if they're smart. That's the incentive, you see. That's the other thing about intervention. One act of intervention encourages more. Welfare encourages people to seek benefits from government rather than by earning money through providing value to society. Corporate welfare does the same. What I have done is an exercise in looking at the seen and unseen, a concept I have written about before. Government policy is often popular because there are obvious good effects that can be seen, but there are other effects that are unseen, and they exist too. They're no less real. You see, what Donald Trump is saying without saying so is the same thing that Barack Obama has been saying for the past 8 years. In essence, the free market has failed. And so we need Donald Trump's government-imposed solutions instead. Here's a quote from the New York Times. On Thursday, yesterday, as he toured the factory floor in Indiana, to take credit for saving roughly half of the 2,000 jobs Indiana stood to lose. Remember when Barack Obama used that phony baloney plastic banana good time rock and roll job metric? Jobs saved or created in connection with his American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which will be dwarfed by Trump's if he gets his way. Trump sent a message to other businesses, sent a message, a threat, as well, that he intended to follow through on his pledges to impose stiff tariffs. You can't do that legally, unilaterally. You just do it by executive order. On imports from companies that move production overseas and ship their products back to the United States. There's the threat. This is the way it's going to be, Trump said in an interview with the New York Times. Corporate America is going to have to understand that we have to take care of our workers also, which you're not doing by pursuing that policy. I don't want them moving out of the country without consequences. Boy, that sounds like Barack Obama. Boy, that sounds, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound like, I don't want them moving out of the country without consequences? But it's Trump who's saying this. Even if it means angering the free market-oriented Republicans he beat in the primaries. Especially, that's part of why he's doing it. Donald Trump is a liberal bleeping Democrat. Listen, Trumplicans, open your eyes. Pull the scales off. It's right in front of you. And listen to what former one-time conservative and now cuck-servative to the nth degree Governor Mike Pence of Indiana said as a follow-on. Quote, the free market has been sorting it out and America's been losing every time. You know, we might as well have just elected Hillary Clinton. Is this the same policy? What free market is that, Cuck Pence? The one that suffers under the crushing weight of federal regulation? With Obama setting records for the number of pages added to the Federal Register? The one that features some of the highest corporate tax rates in the world? That free market? Every time government interference hampers the economy, government blames the free market and hampers it further. I'm really hard-pressed to see what's conservative about any of this. I mean, as Harry Brown used to say, the government is good at one thing. It knows how to break your legs and then hand you a crutch and say, see, if it weren't for the government, you wouldn't be able to walk. I mean, ultimately, at its core, government is the business of stealing. Legalized theft. That's what government does. It's the open and above board mafia. And Trump knows the mafia. He's had mafia connections in the past, so he knows this racket very well. This is going to be the RICO presidency, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you don't keep in mind that it is the government that hampers business in the first place, and that it is U.S. government regulation that makes our businesses fundamentally non-competitive to begin with, then actions like Trump can seem beneficial. But they are not! Again, the unintended consequences of government interference are not abstract. They are very real. Just ask Carrier's competitors who didn't get a tax break because they haven't threatened to move anything to Mexico yet. But they will. That's the other thing about intervention. One act of intervention encourages more. It's all about incentives. Welfare encourages people to seek benefits from government rather than by earning money through providing value to society. Corporate welfare does the same. What I have done is an exercise in looking at the unseen and the seen, a concept I've written about before. Government policy is often popular because there are obvious good effects that can be seen, but there are other effects that are unseen and they exist as well. They're just not politically beneficial to those in power. And Kevin Williamson, and I'm going to get to this in the next segment, attacks the deal from a very similar perspective. It is a quote, it is a company that has competitors who employ Americans and pay taxes just as Carrier does. These firms and their employees are put at an economic disadvantage by the subsidies paid to Carrier thanks to Trump and Pence. That means that some of these companies probably will be less profitable and that they will not hire people they otherwise would have. But you'll see no Trump press conference celebrating that. This is a case of Frederic Basquiat's problem of the seen versus the unseen. The benefits are easy to see. All those sympathetic workers in Indiana that are singing praises to Donald Trump, just like they did to Barack Obama for the past 8 years. The costs are borne by sympathetic workers, too, around the country and by their families and by their neighbors. But those are widely dispersed, so they are harder to see and do not hit with the same calculated, cynical, dramatic impact. The concept of the seen and unseen helps you see the flaw in this widespread argument that we should not criticize Trump because he saved Christmas for a bunch of Indiana families. It can also help you understand why government bailouts are generally bad. Think about it. Under the "he saved Christmas" argument, you could justify a huge range of government intervention. There are many businesses that fail in the United States all over the place. Why not use taxpayer money to save all of those businesses, too? Think of all the Christmases that would be saved. And eventually, like the late Margaret Thatcher once observed, you eventually run out of other people's money. Because wealth has to be created. And if you just shift around the deck chairs on the Titanic, the boat's still going to sink. Now, most people would probably not endorse that proposal, even if they couldn't necessarily explain the economics of why it would be a bad idea. The answer is that when businesses fail, we see the impact that has on people who are thrown out of work. Holding up my hand, that's happened to me before. What we don't see, but which is very important, is that the business was failing because it was doing a bad job with scarce resources. The failure of the business frees up resources to be used by a business that does a better job of satisfying consumers. If all failing businesses were kept afloat, valuable resources would be tied up in losing ventures that don't do any good for anyone, and the economy would collapse. Remember, too big to fail? Remember when this exact same principle was applied to the banks 8 years ago? I seem to recall that Trump supporters didn't think that was all that hot of an idea. So why is it bad when applied to banks, but good when applied to air conditioning manufacturers? It's the same principle. Too big to fail. And the economy ossifies because the government has to intervene massively in order to freeze the fractal chaos of a free market economy. And so it collapses because that fractal chaos is what keeps it going. The fundamental issue is one of distributed intelligence. Which is better to determine how resources should be used? The distributed intelligence of the marketplace or a centralized set of government decision makers? Central planners. When you put it that way, the answer is obvious to most, but you have to think about it first to frame the question in the proper way. And that's where all this emotive liberal statist mania gets in the way. Now, if you don't understand the principles of why a general bailout of all failing businesses is wrong, then it's harder to see the problem when it is done on a small and highly publicized scale. A grandstanding government official who goes around showering largesse here and there like Santa Claus and making sure the cameras are in tow can win a lot of popularity, especially if he has openly declared that the free market no longer works. This is what I warned, not just me. This is what Never Trump has been warning about for a year and a half. You're going to get liberal, Democrat, statist economic policies. You're going to get Obamonomics with Donald Trump's face on it and an R after his name. That's what you're going to get. The economic policies are not going to change. Only the face and the party identifier. That's it. And the GOP is going to take the rap for those disastrous liberal statist economic policies. And the media is not going to play along and say, "Recovery Summer! Recovery Summer!" They're going to call it what it will be, the Trump Depression. And then there's the way that Kevin Williamson, as alluded to in the preceding segment, characterized the carrier bailout, and bailout is what it is, economic stupidity. It's not conservative, but rather a rejection of economic reality. Now, one particularly tough and indigestible nugget of talk radio stupidity, afflicting the guts of conservatism, is the idea that there is some sort of fundamental difference between bribing a business with tax cuts and bribing it with a wheelbarrow full of cash. The Trump-Pence bailout of carriers' operations in Indiana provides an illustrative case. This is an example of banality hardening into orthodoxy, the worst habit of the popcorn mind. It started with a good point. Once upon a time, U.S. personal income tax rates were very high, 91% in the Eisenhower years, though hardly anybody paid that rate. Democrats such as John Kennedy and Republicans such as Ronald Reagan believed that these rates were far too high. Both Kennedy and Reagan made what we might broadly call Laffer curve arguments for tax cuts, though Reagan's actual budget proposals were not quite as sunny as Arthur Laffer tends to be on the question of the real budgetary effects of tax rate reductions. Milton Friedman took a more gimlet-eyed view with his advice that if tax cuts produce revenue growth, then you haven't cut them enough. See, the idea is to cut taxes and cut spending. It's all part of the overall project of reducing the size of government, which ain't going to happen under Donald Trump. But most Democrats, being reflexively big government creatures, liked those 91% tax rates that very few paid because you could make people and businesses jump through all sorts of political hoops to keep from paying them. Corruption, anybody? That still applies, which is why the United States has one of the highest notional corporate tax rates in the developed world, but a rather low effective corporate tax rate. Businesses will do a lot to take that 40% bite down to 12%. Or if you're a politically connected firm like General Electric, down to 0, at least in some years. Because Democrats liked those high rates, they complained in their habitually dishonest way that we couldn't afford the cuts Republicans had proposed. This was pretty transparent stuff. For one thing, it allowed Democrats to partly neutralize the Republican budget hawkery, which was politically potent, while the subsequent demand for offsetting spending cuts made tax cuts a less attractive political proposition. In other words, budget hawkery is only superficially politically potent until it actually starts affecting you. It's great in the abstract, but not in the reality, much like in the left's environmental policy, the climate change hoax and all that. Part of the Republican response to this was based on laugherism, and generally on a very naive version of it. You can't call that notional $1 billion tax cut a $1 billion expenditure because the tax cut will produce growth effects that add to tax revenue, or rather detract from it less than full 100% value. And that is true as far as it goes, which is generally not as far as Republicans take it. There are commonly observed growth effects from cuts in tax rates, but they generally amount to something like 20% of the revenue lost under the static projection model. It all depends on the elasticity of the tax cut in question. It's an economic term, look it up. Sometimes they have been more than that, but the popcorn belief that growth effects frequently amount to more than 100% of foregone revenue, the tax cuts pay for themselves or pay for themselves and then some. And some of them do, like capital gains cuts definitely pay for themselves and then some. But overall, in a general sense, it is not sustained by the evidence, and certainly not from the evidence of modern advanced economies with tax rates that are already relatively low, both by world standards and by historical standards. But whatever the growth effects are, that's a question of whether our model for estimating the budgetary cost of tax rate reductions is any good. It is not, as our talk radio economists insist, a question of whether those costs actually are costs. If a $1 trillion tax cut turns out to lower revenue by only $800 billion instead of the full trillion, well, that is still, as a bottom line matter, indistinguishable from spending $800 billion. This is of particular interest to a government that is carrying a very large debt load. The math doesn't care whether your deficit comes from the revenue side of the ledger or the expenditure side. Debt is debt. Republicans might have had a little bit of a point in the question of general tax cuts. A tax cut and spending are different things, even if the budgetary effects are exactly the same. But in the matter of industry-specific or firm-specific tax benefits of the sort extended to Carrier in Indiana, they do not have a leg on which to stand. These are straight-up corporate welfare, ethically and fiscally indistinguishable from shipping containers full of $100 bills. All about the Benjamins, baby. Those who take the opposite view work very hard to make a case that there is some kind of important ethical distinction between giving somebody something and declining to take something away from them. But relieving someone of an ordinary expense incurred in the normal course of affairs, as opposed to changing general tax law, is a gift. This is true both as a matter of law and of our ordinary experience. If I am, for example, a car dealer trying to win influence with a politician, and I sell him a new car at $50,000 under the price that I charge other customers, then I have paid him a $50,000 bribe, in effect. People go to jail for that, you know. You'll recall that part of the Barack Obama-Tony Rezko scandal was the accusation that Rezko had arranged for the promising young politician to buy a house at $300,000 under its asking price. Rezko didn't give Obama $300,000 in this scenario. He just saw to it that Obama didn't have to spend that $300,000. That is why bribery laws generally specify any pecuniary benefit rather than a duffel bag full of cash. For Carrier's accountant, any pecuniary benefit will do. So far as the bottom line is concerned, a $7 million tax credit is the same as a $7 million check, or $7 million in Apple stock, or $7 million in gold. It's all $7 million on the line where you want it. Just a question of where. The ethical question is more complicated. And by the way, tax credits, which is a reduction in tax expense, see, that's less visible. It doesn't come in the revenue section. It's a reduction in expenses. But the bottom line effect is exactly the same. It's just less visible. Oh, I don't know. You might get a footnote mention in a set of audited financial statements. Still less visible. Now, the ethical question is more complicated than the pop cons let on as well. Our government runs deficits, which means that a federal tax credit of $1 million given to Smith is $1 million in taxes that eventually will have to be paid by Jones, Wilson, and Humperdinck with interest. In other words, debt, borrowing. Well, it's not Jones, Wilson, Humperdinck, it's Janet Yellen. Carrier is a division of United Technologies, the Otis Elevator and Pratt & Whitney engines people, which is first and foremost a government contractor. See where this is headed? A firm that derives at least a quarter of its revenue from government contracts, the taxpayer, in other words, and 10% of it from Pentagon contracts alone. I guess I'm going to have to start calling that Trumpagon. Contracts alone. It is a company that has competitors who employ Americans and pay taxes just as Carrier does. These firms and their employees are put at an economic disadvantage by the subsidies paid to Carrier thanks to Trump and Pence. That means that some of these companies probably will be less profitable and that they will not hire people they otherwise would have hired. Those 1,000 people that would have been laid off, they could have gone to work for Carrier's competitors. Probably would have. But you'll see no Trump press conference celebrating that any more than you would have seen it from Obama. This is a case of Frederic Bastier's problem of the seen versus the unseen. The benefits are easy to see. All those sympathetic sob story workers in Indiana. The costs are borne by sympathetic workers too, however, around the country and by their families and by their neighbors. But those are widely dispersed, so they are harder to see and do not hit with the same cynical, dramatic impact. But the math is the math is the math. Trump and Pence are trying to sell you a free lunch. Same way the liberal Democrats and Keynesians and progressives and their magical spending multiplier do when they promise the government stimulus programs, which Trump is pushing one of those too, will somehow magically pay for themselves. So here's the thing. There is no magical revenue fairy. Tanstaffel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. As a budgetary matter, targeted tax benefits are identical to spending, both for the government and for the beneficiary. This is not a question of ethics, but a question of accounting. Somebody always has to pay the bill eventually. Probably won't be the popcorn on the radio telling you that we can make money by giving it away, spending ourselves rich. So long as we give it away to the right sort of people, you know, Solyndra bad, Carrier good, Black Lives Matter bad, KKK good. Yeah, it's like I'm telling you, I've been telling you this for a year and a half. Trump supporters are not conservatives. They are not capitalists. All they are is just another identity politics group with its hand out. Remember the Yosemite Sam catchphrase? If you can't beat them, join them. This is Obamanomics for white America. That's what it is. Obamanomics for ex-conservative white Americans, no different than Black America or Hispanic America or pick whatever other ethnic slice of the population you want to make. It is liberalism, it is statism, no different from Obamanomics other than who gets the goodies. You know, conservatives have a hard enough time of it as it is without inflicting needless stupidity on themselves. But, as I keep saying, folks, that ship has sailed. And by the time you realize what a disaster you have inflicted on us all, well, it'll be even more too late, I guess.